Hello everyone and welcome. So in this video, you will be able to explain what the term industrial capitalism means, and you'll be able to identify and explain at least two progressive reforms that addressed industrial capitalism. So first, let's talk about what is industrial capitalism. Well, industrial capitalism is the idea that major industries should be allowed to grow without any government interference. Many people working in the government during this time felt that allowing businesses to operate with fewer rules would lead to the best and the cheapest goods. However, we know that during the Industrial Revolution, we see the rise of monopolies. And our progressives saw the negative aspects of industrial capitalism and laissez faire economics and the things that came out of industrial capitalism, such as monopolies, such as poor working conditions and high prices and low wages, and products that were made cheaply and not with great quality. And so remember, our muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell worked to expose the negative aspects of this system. So our progressive presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all introduced legislation and reforms to combat the ills of industrial capitalism. These presidents are known as being trust busters, as they endorsed antitrust legislation. You should know that a trust is just another word for a monopoly. And we know that monopolies raise prices, lower wages, and make the economy unstable. So these presidents advocate for more government regulation over various industries. They also undertake conservation efforts to help keep American land safe from development that rose from the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, they focus on consumer protection and try to prohibit companies from selling products that are unsafe or harmful to the consumer. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each of our progressive presidents. So our first president, progressive president, is Teddy Roosevelt. And you should know that prior to Teddy Roosevelt taking office, the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed in 1890, and this piece of legislation made monopolies illegal. Well, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed under President Benjamin Harrison, was around for more than a decade and had only been invoked only rarely against industrial monopolies. It hadn't really ever been enforced. And so we see the first vigorous enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act occur under the administration of President Roosevelt. And so during Roosevelt's presidency, we see an expansion of executive power as he starts to come down on all of these trusts. So here are a couple of examples of him doing this in front of you. So one, the Northern Securities. This was a railroad monopoly that part of which was owned by our friend J.P. Morgan, which you might remember from the Industrial Revolution. J.P. Morgan owned a stretch of this railroad company all the way from Chicago to the Pacific coast. And the Northern Securities were charging farmers very high prices to ship their goods. And so you might remember that this was part of the reason why the populace and those farmers were upset in the late 1800s. So Roosevelt instructs the Justice Department to break up the railroad monopoly. And while Northern Securities appeal to the Supreme Court, they lose. And so Roosevelt is successful in here in breaking up this railroad monopoly that J.P. Morgan was a part of. Another piece of important legislation to come out of Roosevelt's administration was the Hepburn Act. And the purpose was to give this government organization, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, the authority to set, quote, just and reasonable rates for railroads and to help break up the power of railroad monopolies. So we see Teddy Roosevelt hitting railroad monopolies twice here with the Northern Securities in 1904 and then the Hepburn Act in 1906. Roosevelt also makes gains against oil monopolies. So remember, Standard Oil, owned by John Rockefeller, the richest man in the world at this time. So John Rockefeller and Standard Oil had been in and out of court regarding trust busting lawsuits. And finally, in 1909, the U.S. Justice Department files a suit against Standard Oil, and the government essentially is successful and it forces Standard Oil to break up into 34 smaller companies. So it breaks this monopoly. And some of the current day relatives of Standard Oil that you might be familiar with that still exist today are these major oil companies that you have probably seen as you drive around. Our next trust-busting president is William Howard Taft. Taft continued many of Roosevelt's policies. He was also a conservationist like Roosevelt and worked to protect the national forests, and we'll talk more about some conservation efforts here in a second. He also prosecuted almost twice the number of antitrust cases as Teddy Roosevelt. So he comes down very hard on monopolies operating at this time. One major progressive measure under Taft was the Mann-Elkins Act in 1910, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, the power to suspend new railroad rates and oversee telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. So a major piece of legislation coming from Taft there. Again, more regulation over railroads with the addition of telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. Our final trust-busting president is Woodrow Wilson. So let's think back to the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was weak and only declared monopolies illegal. The Clayton Antitrust Act builds on the Sherman Antitrust Act in that it defined as illegal the business practices that are conducive to the formation of monopolies. So if a company started quickly consolidating all of their competition, before they were officially a monopoly, the Clayton Antitrust Act would step in and tell companies that they could not do that. The Clayton Antitrust Act is also important because it gave more power to labor unions. It exempted labor unions from antitrust suits and declared essentially that strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing were all perfectly legal. And so that is another important aspect of the Clayton Antitrust Act. Under Wilson, we also get the Federal Trade Commission Act, which was created to protect consumers against unfair business practices. And it was essentially a committee of 5 people who were appointed by the president. And their job was to issue orders to specific companies who were being unfair to consumers or who were on the road to creating monopolies. Finally, under Woodrow Wilson, we get the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which creates the Federal Reserve. So this allowed the government to regulate the banking industry. And it created essentially 12 Federal Reserve banks, which each serve specific regions of the country. And the Federal Reserve essentially allows the government to control the amount of money in circulation. And it does this by setting interest rates. We'll talk more about that this year, but today we refer to this as monetary policy, the ability of the government to control the money supply by setting interest rates. And this is the first time, why this is significant, is this is the first time that our government becomes involved in ensuring that our economy is successful. So remember all the variety of booms and busts that occurred throughout the 1870s through the 1890s, the various panics that occurred as a result of monopolies and unstable economies. The Federal Reserve Act and the creation of the Federal Reserve helps to stabilize and regulate the economy. We also get some important legislation around the type of products that can be released to the consumers. So, just a reminder that of Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, one of our muckrakers, a quote from him here in The Jungle: "This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat will be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling will not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one." So at this time, there was no regulation around the types of food that was being distributed to the consumer. And so we see in the early 1900s, in 1906, we get out of these two pieces of legislation, which were passed on the same day, were a specific reaction to The Jungle. And so we get the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, which gave the U.S. government the power to regulate the sale and manufacturing of the food and drug industries. And so it basically made it illegal for these industries to sell products that could harm consumers. And again, this is a turning point because we see that the government here is getting more involved to make sure that companies are not selling products that could harm consumers. And so the government is getting directly involved in consumer protection. Finally, I want to talk about the environmental regulations that came out of the Progressive Era. So as a result of the Industrial Revolution, natural resources were being used up at alarming rates due to heavy industry. And so Teddy Roosevelt really calls attention to the negative effects of industry on the environment. And so under Roosevelt, we get the Newlands Act in 1902. This essentially gave federal money to Western states to help pay for irrigation and land development. And this helped farmers dramatically. So remember that the farmers were kind of the impetus for this whole thing, starting with the populists and then leading to the Progressive Era. So now farmers are finally getting some help from the federal government to help irrigate their land. We also get the U.S. Forest Service. So this essentially regulated the lumber industry. So it regulated lumbering on federal land and protected the forests. It also established national parks and wildlife reservations. And this then leads to, a decade later, Woodrow Wilson establishing the National Park Service, which officially developed our national park system. So those are just a few of the reforms that come out of the Progressive Era in regards to industrial capitalism, environmental regulations, business regulations, and economic regulations. Thanks for listening.